The purpose of today's webinar is to get an inside look on how candidates running for the Ward 2 seat on DC Council look at animal policies. I want to go ahead and thank and welcome our candidates today. We have Brooke Pinto, Daniel Hernandez, Jack Evans, John Fanning, Jordan Grossman, Kishan Putta, Patrick Kennedy, and Yilin Zhang. Thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Max Broad. I'm the founder of DC Voters for Animals. Our mission is to coalesce the voice of the animal voter in Washington, D.C. DC Voters for Animals advocates for all animals, whether wildlife, animals used in farms or labs, or companion animals such as our dogs and cats. By equipping ordinary citizens with the tools to be effective in the halls of DC Council, we strive to normalize strong animal policy and reshape our society's relationship with non-human animals for the better. I'll let you all know that DC Voters for Animals recently released a report. It's our 2020 assessment of DC Council on animal policy. In this, you'll see findings on how council members have performed on animal issues. So go ahead and check out how your council member has supported animal issues over the past few years. You can see more on our website, dcvfa.com. That's DC Voters for Animals, dcvfa.com. So tonight's forum, the way we're going to run is we'll have opening remarks, we'll have questions for candidates, audience questions, and closing remarks. I want to thank my colleagues, Jonathan Rufrano, Riley Place, and Alexis Lopez-Palayo for helping organize and order today's forum. And if for the portion on the audience questions, if you have a question for the candidate, you can submit it to Alexis via his email at alexis@dcvfa.com. That's alexis@dcvfa.com. Or you can send it to us via Twitter. And you can do that using the hashtag W2Animals. That's hashtag W2Animals. Before we get started, I want to be sure to thank our co-hosts for today's forum who helped plan, promote, and draft content for the forum. And those organizations, we have a lot of great organizations who are involved, including Vegan Life, American University's Animal Law Society, the Animal Law Committee of the Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources Community of the DC Bar, DC Environmental Network, George Washington University Law's Student Animal Legal Defense Fund, Opening Doors, and the Veg Society of DC. Now, we're going to do something, we're going to take advantage of the fact that we are operating via webinar right now, and we are going to do some polling. And in the spirit of the Intelligence Squared podcast, we're going to do a poll at the beginning and the conclusion of the forum so that folks can indicate who they are supporting and whether any of the candidates were able to win over their support over the course of the forum tonight and the discussion tonight. So go ahead and indicate where you're leaning for in regards to our Ward 2 candidates. We'll run another poll at the end of the forum, and we'll see how folks turn out. So thank you for submitting that, and all the results will be anonymous. And last thing before we get started is a dedication. I'd just like to dedicate this event to my mom who passed recently. And I just want to send a special word to all the great moms out there. Great, okay, let's jump into the forum. And we're gonna start with opening remarks and give the candidates an opportunity to share how animals have been important in their lives. And we'll start with John Fanning.
Thank you, Max. I'm sorry for your loss. My thoughts and prayers are with you and your family. Again, my name is John Fanning, and I'm running for DC City Council because I want to solve problems for residents, and I know how to do it. I'm a grassroots community leader with a track record with getting significant results in my ANC commission. As many of you know, I'm a 6-term ANC commissioner from Logan Circle. I'm currently serving as the chairman. I've worked for 5 mayors, and I have an understanding in the power of our government and the limitations. As council member, I want to specifically focus on fixing DCRA, improving homeless services, and provide first-class constituent services to the residents of Ward 2. I realize the city has made tremendous progress in the past 2 decades, but there are still people who have been left behind. I believe I have the commitment, passion, and history of helping those who can't help themselves, and working together, we can make a significant difference in the lives of our residents of Ward 2. I want to thank you for hosting this Animal Rights Forum. And I just want to bring up, I've had several different pets in my lifetime. I've owned 5 different dogs as a child. And I have been very active in supporting the construction and installation of dog parks. I am very active with the Friends of the Shore Dog Park. And I also want to, for the record, let you know, during the time when a Canadian company was running the animal shelter on New York Avenue, I also advised then Tony Williams that a local company should be running it, which was the Humane Society, and they were awarded the contract. I think my time is up, so thank you.
Great, thanks so much, John. Okay, we'll
Sure.
move to Patrick.
Well, thank you very much, Max. And I want to echo John in offering my condolences to you on the loss of your mom. And I want to thank you for organizing this forum. I think this is the very first virtual candidate forum that we've done since the pandemic descended on us all. And I think that caught a lot of people off guard, and a lot of candidate forums were canceled altogether, but you adapted very quickly and you provided us with this forum. So I'm grateful for that. I've been an advisory neighborhood commissioner in the Foggy Bottom neighborhood for the last 8 years. I've been the ANC chair here for 5. And I think that, you know, when you have a degree of understanding the communities in the ward and in the city, you understand the important role that animals play in the lives of our residents. And for my part, personally, like many, I grew up with pets. I had one cat in particular that I found. She was a stray in the bushes outside of the mailbox of my house when I was 2 years old. And I took that cat inside, and that cat was with me for the rest of my childhood. And that's, I still to this day, that's my favorite pet that I've ever had. Unfortunately, I live in a studio apartment and I'm usually out. Obviously now everybody's home, but you know, when you're out 16 hours a day, you can't keep a pet like you might like. So I have to live vicariously through the pets of others. And we've actually done things as a campaign to promote a lot of our supporters who have pets. We even have dog bandanas that we've created. But I mean, all of this, I think, gets to a really serious point, which is animals are important companions for our residents, particularly in urban centers with a lot of people who live alone. One of the things that I've been exposed to, especially during this pandemic, are the number of seniors, especially who live by themselves and are prone to social isolation. And the companionship that pets provide is really important for those people. And particularly now more than ever. And so, you know, whether it's dealing with dog park issues and mediating on some of the conflicts that we've had as a community on the use of Francis Field, I know that similar stories have played out elsewhere, you know, with Mitchell Park and Sheridan Calorama and some other parts of the ward. There's just a lot that we've done as a community, I think, to support our pets, and that we need to continue to do to make this a more livable city for all of our residents. And I look forward to discussing those specific issues. I was pleased, Max, that you were able to join on the Sierra Club last week. So look forward to continuing those sorts of conversations. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Patrick. All right, next we'll move to Daniel.
Hey, good afternoon. Let me also, give my condolences for the loss of your mother. It's it gets better. So just a little bit about myself. I'm Danny Hernandez. I am also one of the crowd running for the Ward 2 council position. A little bit about myself. I'm a Marine Corps Afghan vet. I'm a father of 2, live here in DuPont, work in technology at Microsoft for, a little over 7 years now. When I think about the pets in my life, I have to be transparent. I've always been a cat person. I've had several dogs through my life as well. And one in particular, a black lab was, I guess, my favorite of those. But it's always been the cats that are very close to my heart. I think particularly as, someone who has, had a bit of a desk job. I've done a lot of work from home over the past several years and grew up with video games and so on quite a bit. Just sitting there at the desk, having, one of the various cats I've had in my life in my lap at the computer desk, just that companionship has always been very important to me. We haven't yet committed because we do have to ask the landlord, but we are planning to foster a kitten during this time. We have some travel and there's some things up in the air, so we can't commit full time to a pet just yet, but hopefully it's coming soon. Actually want to echo, like what Patrick mentioned, helping people with isolation. People get lonely and pets are an important aspect of that companionship. And, it's essential that we have policy and as a district care for our animals. I think it's all the time I have. So thank you and look forward to the forum.
Great, thanks, Daniel. Okay, next we'll have Kishan.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me, Max, and very sorry for your loss. I feel very bad about that. Good luck and good wishes, and may she rest in peace. I'm Kishan Putta. Thank you for having me. I care so much about these issues. My mom and dad were born in India and villages and always taught me to coexist with the animals of our world. And so I really have a great amount of respect for you and for the other co-sponsors of this forum. I was reading a lot about the open organization, Opening Doors. Some friends of mine recently were trying to get their building to allow pets, and it's the building I lived in for about 10 years. And so I helped them with that fight, and I think it is so important because I have been involved for many years as an ANC commissioner elected in 2 different parts of Ward 2, in the DuPont Circle neighborhood and now here in the Burleith neighborhood. I definitely have worked on dog parks as well, and this is my cat Neely. He's a Siamese, and my wife is vegetarian. We're raising our son to be vegetarian. I might show you him if I get a chance. But I deeply care about these issues and about all the animal lovers in DC, including myself. We need to make this city better with a higher quality of life, and that includes animals. For people living in public housing, for people living in private housing, they should be able to live with an animal companion. We should be more humane to our animal companions on this planet. As I mentioned, my wife is vegetarian. We just served our son a plant-based meal. We buy plant-based at Safeway all the time, and it tastes pretty good. I'm a sponsor of the Good Food Institute. My former neighbor and constituent is the head of it, and there's so many great plant-based options coming up, and I talk about it all the time. I'm hoping to give up meat myself, and I really appreciate what you're trying to push for in terms of it being better for the environment and for the whole world if we can reduce our meat consumption. And I look forward to answering the rest of your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great. Okay, we will have Jordan next.
Thank you, Max. I want to extend my condolences on the loss of your mom as well. I know has to be incredibly difficult. Actually, one of the connections to animals that I wanted to speak about briefly was some of my earliest memories of my grandfather, Julius, where we would go for walks with his dog, and it's some of how I learned how to take care of every living thing, and I learned so much from him. And unfortunately, he passed away when I was fairly young, but I actually my wife and I just had a baby who is named for him. So it just sort of is a nice reminder of how we can keep people's memories alive. So for those of you who I haven't met yet, my name is Jordan Grossman. I'm a 5th generation DC resident. I've spent my career in public service. I've worked for President Obama. I've worked for DC's Medicaid agency, DC's federal court, and on Capitol Hill. I think it's really important that we in government spend our time focused on making it work for people, making services better and easier to access. I think it's really important that the council, the DC Council, is not only focused on, putting forward strong proposals and legislation, but actually making sure that our laws and programs are working for those we serve. And I think that's more important than ever when it comes to the public health emergency we're in right now and how it affects how we treat animals. So I think a few folks have mentioned, but one of the epidemics that we've been dealing with as a community from before the time of coronavirus has been an epidemic of loneliness. And it is something that's affecting people. It has huge health ramifications. It affects people who are most vulnerable and who are older even more. It affects more people than have diabetes or who smoke, but it has not been central to our conversation. I think especially right now during this public health emergency, we haven't been talking enough about the effects of this social isolation, the health effects on all of us. Now, one of the best ways we can deal with that is through the companionship of animals, and it's been pretty fantastic to see how that has helped people get through this crisis. And I think we need to think about how we can foster that as a community and as a city. And we need to recognize that there are so many things we can do, whether it's at the level of supporting dog parks and things like that, or if it's making sure people can live with their pets. We have one of the biggest issues we confront in DC is the lack of affordable housing. We need to change the rules so that people in public housing can keep their pets with them. It's one of the most important things we can do to make sure that all of these issues are not getting made worse, but rather we're making them better. And so I think that is one of the issues I hope we focus on. I think we also need to focus on having an animal welfare liaison in the DC government. One of the things that I know a lot of organizations are concerned about is that after this crisis passes, are we going to have a surge of folks, a need for fostering animals and a need for shelter space? And I think we need to make sure that our government is putting, as I said at the top, putting our laws to work, not just when we pass it initially, but to make sure we're making this work for us going forward. So thank you, Max. Thank you to everyone who's co-sponsored this event. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Jordan. And congratulations on your youngest.
Thank you.
Brooke, you can go next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brooke Pinto. I really appreciate you, Max, and the DC Voters for Animals for putting this together so we all can share our respective visions. And I'm so sorry to hear about the insurmountable loss of your mom. And I'm really glad that we can honor her tonight through the course of this forum. So thank you in her honor. Our community is really hurting right now. And I have the citywide legislative experience to help get us through this crisis. I'm a tax attorney. I have represented the DC Office of Tax and Revenue. Most recently, I was the Assistant Attorney General for Policy and Legislative Affairs at the DC Office of the Attorney General, where I represented the DC Council, the Mayor's Office, and many of the agencies therein. I want to support our small businesses and give our emergency responders the support they need. I want to ensure our children have the resources they need to get back on track after this semester long of distance learning. And importantly, I want to do all of this in a sustainable way so that our city does not go bankrupt and some difficult choices are going to need to be made. We are in a time of crisis, and when we're in a time of crisis, we need to care most deeply about the vulnerable among us, and that includes our animals. I was very pleased to see Matt Birdschacker from the ASPCA 2 days ago say that adoptions were way up from shelters during this crisis, and I hope that trend continues. In fact, 2 days ago, 2 of my closest friends both adopted from shelters, and hope that continues on. Animals have always been really important to me. I think they bring out some of our finer instincts as humans. I had a bunny and 2 gerbils, Snowball, Monica, and Brandy growing up, as well as a cat for the last 15 years, Buttercup, who just passed away last year. And our family has 2 dogs, Quincy and Lulu, named after third-string Jets quarterback, Quincy. And so really important to make sure that people have what they need to continue adopting. And also, I've always been an advocate to allow for animals in public housing. And this is something where statehood continues to be really important. A lot of the contingencies the federal government puts over our housing policies disallow us from implementing the laws as we see best for our own district. And this is as better time as any when the Congress just passed $2 trillion for the CARES Act. This is the time to use that leverage to go back and say we need to work within our own bounds, even if it's not complete statehood, as I'll continue advocating for that, but to make sure that our residents in DC can stay with their pets and do not get separated. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion this evening about how we can be most supportive to our shelters, our adopted families, and make sure that farms in the region are treating animals with respect, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Brooke. Okay, next we'll have Jack.
Thank you very much. And Max, let me begin by telling you how sorry I am about passing away of your mom. And I also want to take this opportunity to express my condolences on the passing away of Peter Wolf. Peter was the owner of the In-Towner, a 35-year friend of mine, and somebody who committed himself to the DuPont Circle in the District of Columbia. So it's very unfortunate to hear that he passed away today. And he certainly will be missed greatly by all of us. And I want to take this opportunity, Max, to thank you and the DC Voters for Animals for hosting the forum. It is important, especially at this time, to discuss how to protect and support our animal friends. And all my life, I have been a pet owner. When I was growing up, we had Dachshunds, and for the last 22 years, I've had Golden Retrievers. My wife and I were married in 1993. We purchased Kayla, and more recently Kelly, and they've been companions of mine on my runs and pretty much everything I've done for my life. So in my view, there's no better companion to have than a dog. You know the old expression about Washington. I believe as a candidate running to represent Ward 2 on the council, elected officials must do everything we can to ensure that our companions are protected from abuse, that endangered species aren't used for public and private gain, and do everything we can to enact policies to improve the health of our residents and the environment. And I was proud as the council member to co-sponsor the Healthy Student Amendment Act, the Dining with Dogs Act, the Elephant, Ivory, and Rhino Horned Trafficking Prohibition Act. And there are a number of bills now before the council that as your council member, I will make sure get passed. One thing I was known for on the council is the person who can get said faster than anybody else. So I know how to get bills passed, and we'll make sure they get done. And as a supporter of animals, as you know, I was able to get the Shaw Dog Park open and the DuPont Circle Dog Park at 7th and T Street open, which without my support would not have happened. However, the world has changed. The world has changed dramatically in the last 2 months. The city is expected to lose about $1 billion in revenue between now and September 30th. There's no doubt that the members of the council and the mayor will be tested. We need to make painful and very difficult and unpopular decisions in order to balance the budget. This is a moment for decisive action to protect our financial standing so that we will focus on bold animal welfare policies. Right now, we need clear thinking about what our priorities are and the policies we need to protect animals, our residents, the environment, and our city. So I want to thank you again for hosting this forum, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thanks again, Max.
Apologies, I was on mute. Thanks so much, Jack. And lastly, we'll have Yilin.
Hi, everyone. This is Yilin. Max, I'm so sorry to hear about your mom, and my thoughts and prayers with you and your family. Thank you also for taking the time to organize with all of the co-sponsors this important conversation, because I think right now it's, as all of the candidates have said, it's a very difficult time for all of us, especially with the physical distancing and the social isolation. It's very difficult for everyone in DC and across the country. So a little bit about myself. I've been campaigning for the last 7 months. I came to DC about 10 years ago. I'm a transplant from Michigan, and I'm a first-generation Chinese American. And I've been a lover of animals all my life. The impact of that has come from mostly my grandmother. So my father grew up on a farm, and my grandmother would essentially take home every animal that she found. So she would end up with like 5 cats and 5 dogs at the same time. And it was really, I think what caught me from her experience with animals is the amount of compassion and the love that she gave to them, but it was also reciprocated probably 10 times more. And I've always wanted to have a dog or a cat, but when we immigrated here, I was 3 years old, and we didn't have the financial ability to adopt or buy a dog or a cat. So I never actually had a bigger furry animal. I was able to get a hamster when I was about 6 years old, and I really loved that hamster to death. And as I got older and I moved to DC, about 10 years ago, I then became one of those young professionals that, was out of my apartment most of the day, and I couldn't take care of an animal. And so I didn't feel like I had the ability, and especially at this period too, to adopt an animal. And so that's something I would really like to do down the line. But I know that myself and many other professionals in DC are not able to do that. And especially with the fact that in Ward 2, the majority of people live in apartments that are smaller sized, it's really difficult to raise an animal and have them in your apartment. So with that said, I want to make sure that in our policies, we are proactive and comprehensive. And I think, in light of COVID-19, we're starting to see that we don't really understand how the impact of human changes on our environment can affect basically public health. So with COVID-19, we are changing our ecosystem, we are changing nature, and we are affecting the animal behavior. And so that's essentially what I believe has caused this pandemic. And I believe that in my lifetime, this is not the last pandemic. So I think it's really important that for me, in running for office, it's important to make sure that we create policy that is transparent and accountable, and make sure to have an eye on the future, and that we have these conversations up front so that we can prevent, I'm seeing time up, so that we can prevent more public health crises like this. Thank you.
Much, Yilin, and I want to apologize for folks. It looks like we had some of those famous Zoom bombers. No, am I still muted? No, okay. So we're working on resolving that, but I want to thank all of our candidates for giving their opening statements. Let's go ahead and move into the questions now. For our first question, Yilin, you segued us nicely. So the coronavirus has many of us thinking about our relationship with animals. Following a bipartisan congressional coalition letter to the World Health Organization that called on a ban on live animal or wet markets, New York and California introduced bills to ban such wet markets. The bills would also cut off imports of exotic and endangered wildlife that could spread zoonotic diseases like COVID-19. Is there action that you as a candidate would advise DC take to prevent new epidemics from taking place? And as a reminder, each candidate will have 60 seconds to speak on this portion. All right, we're gonna do, I'll list off three. We'll have Daniel, Patrick, and then Yilin in that order, starting with Daniel.
You good. So I think I agree with those wet market bans. I think, here in DC, some of the broader measures around sanitation and I guess cleanliness and treatment, are not necessarily DC, as we don't have a whole lot of farm and livestock space here in DC. But in particular, the bans on exotic pets and trades. As we talk about the ivory trade, recently when we had our initial conversations a few months ago, finding out that that's actually not banned here in DC, and we're actually a sizable market for that. I think it's something that we have to be more conscientious of overall things that we need to improve, and not what's just grabs publicity or is top of mind for everyone.
Great, thank you, Daniel. Patrick?
Yeah, I think it's really important that at our food markets that we follow best practices as far as sanitation and hygiene. And I think specifically, thinking about the Main Avenue fish market, that's the market that most readily comes to mind when we're talking about markets that purvey fish in that particular case. But, certainly I think at our farmers markets as well. And so I think the Department of Health has a major role to play. And I will say that I have found them, at least during this pandemic, to be very responsive to issues specifically involving the handling of food. But there's a lot that I think that we can do to make our healthcare system more resilient, to improve outcomes, I think, in terms of especially health disparities in wards 7 and 8, to reduce the number of people who are immunocompromised and at higher mortality risk during these sorts of pandemics, because I think in a globalized world, a lot of this really occurs at a much greater level in the District of Columbia, but I think our healthcare system can be made more resilient. We can employ best practices in sanitation and hygiene, and we can be more resilient for future instances if and when they come.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. And Yilin? No, you're on mute.
Oh,
Good. Now you're good.
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was saying that I agree a lot with what Daniel and Patrick have said. I think it's really important that at this time, people are constantly educated about how they can interact with the healthcare system. And so what I mean by that is with COVID-19, a lot of people are showing up at the medical centers of the hospitals seeking care, but not necessarily knowing that they could get something from people there or pass something that they don't know that they have. So it's really important to educate people about how they can reach their providers, where to get the care, where to get the testing. And I think in terms of prevention, this is an entire public health issue of we need to make sure that people have access to financial resources, have access to stable housing, have access to equitable quality healthcare resources. And I think that's our best bet against pandemics.
Thanks, Yilin. Would you like to comment on the bills and resolutions that have been introduced in New York
Yes.
and California?
So I absolutely agree with those bans. I think that it's time that we take a strong stand against the wet markets. I mean, whether or not it was an animal that transmitted to a human, etc., it's important that we treat our animals with respect, and that we don't have cases where animals are stacked on top of one another and treated very inhumanely.
Great. Thanks so much. Okay, so next we will have John, Jack, and Kishan.
Yes, thank you. So I agree with pretty much everything that has been said, and particularly the wet markets and how we cannot probably accommodate the inspections for them, and the risk that we take by supporting them opening here in our city. And also the disparity in healthcare. So that's why it's so important that we build a state-of-the-art hospital east of the river, because they don't get many of the medical services we do in the rest of the part of the city. So this is just another example of healthcare disparity. And I also think that, animal cruelty and how the transporting of these animals across the globe that are not quite monitored or enforced, is very risky. So I agree pretty much with what everyone else has mentioned. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, John. Jack?
Thanks again, Max. Yes, what I would do is encourage both the mayor and the council, and particularly the council in their upcoming meetings, to take a look at what California and New York have done and pretty much adopt what they've done. Because certainly with the wet markets and with the banning the exotic animals, these are first steps really that are necessary to try and control the problems we're having now and prevent them from happening in the future. And then on a broader scale, again, as a member of the council, I had advocated for years about expanding our healthcare system. Support enormously my colleague Vince Gray from Ward 7 in getting a brand new hospital built on the St. Elizabeth's campus, and have also supported the extension and the creation of urgent care centers all around our city, particularly in wards 5, 7, and 8, that lack the same kind of health care that other wards in this city have. And that's what's going to be critical in treating any future viruses. But in the current situation, I would just encourage all of our residents to stay home. I go out and jog 5 miles every day. And in my jogging, I am still very much astonished by how many people are out and about. I gave up counting on the waterfront the other day. And again, if we are going to beat the situation we're in now, people have to take this more seriously and have to stay home and have to get control of what's happening here so that we can get rid of this virus once and for all. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you. And Kishan.
Thank you. I've been following this crisis very closely. I have 15 years of healthcare experience here in DC. The last 6 years I spent with DC HealthLink, focusing on DC healthcare issues, working on community outreach and enrollment, on fulfilling President Obama's healthcare law here in DC, making sure everybody had healthcare access so that they can get the testing that they need right now. Just this past week, as a commissioner in my own district, 2 blocks away from here, we opened up a testing center. And I'm very glad, because we need to all do our part. I'm talking with hospitals and doctors all the time. I'm actually endorsed by President Obama's Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, who did just write a book about loneliness and the clinical issues involved in loneliness and how pets can help in that time. And I do want to answer your question. Wet markets have lots of ethical issues. They should be banned. They have slaughter on site, and it's not monitored, and it is often too cruel. And we need to. There's no place for that. But I do want to say one last thing while I have time. We need to dispel some myths here. COVID was not caused by animals. There's no proof you can catch it from an animal. You should not abandon your animal. You should not abandon your pet. You should not fear pets. You should not fear animals. There's no evidence that COVID there's very little evidence that you can get it from an animal. So don't worry about that. There's too many pets being abandoned in this world. One last myth. Asian Americans, I'm on Mayor Bowser's Asian American Relations Commission.
Thank you, Kishan.
That community is being discriminated against, and it is wrong. You should not discriminate against the Asian American community for this. It is not their fault in any way, shape, or form. Thank you.
Great. And then we'll have Brooke and Jordan.
Thanks. So I think the wet markets are a huge problem. There should not be live animals permitted at wet markets, and we need to be a leader on these issues and not always wait for other states to move the ball along. So I think that's really important to work for as the DC Council. I also will work with the Department of Health to make sure that we have a vaccine available for this crisis now, but laws are only going to be as strong as our enforcement, and factor farms lacking regulations, which can lead to more spread of the disease, are a big problem. And then with hospitals, resiliency has been brought up, and Jack, with all due respect, I don't know how after 30 years on the council, there still isn't a hospital in 7 or 8. I think that's absolutely ridiculous. There are 97% of our residents have insurance, health insurance, and that doesn't mean anything if they don't actually have a place to go. So I'm absolutely, in the short term, we need to have at least urgent care centers built around 7 and 8 so that people can have preventative health care to prevent this crisis from happening in the future.
Thank you, Brooke. And lastly, Jordan.
So first off, yeah, agree on the approach from the WHO in New York and California. I think this also gets to public health when you're talking about preventing this in the future. So I think we need to do better on disease monitoring and registries. So when I worked at the Department of Health and Human Services, one of the things we tried to do was to build the capacity of state and local entities across the country so that they can track these types of things. One great example of where it was successful in tracking something early, even though it's very tragic, was the Flint water crisis. The way that was tracked was through a local physician who saw the trend, right, and things like that. but what we've seen is a systematic underinvestment in public health infrastructure. So I think that's something that the council can do, is to promote our public health infrastructure. Not once we're in a pandemic, we're too late. We need to make sure that we're building this capacity in advance. And then secondly, it is our healthcare capacity. We do need to do better for our residents. In particular, we've seen complete racial inequity in terms of who is affected by coronavirus in DC. The Black community is disproportionately affected and disproportionately bearing the burden of fatalities in this crisis. I think that makes clear that not only do we need to build our healthcare system, we need to build the structural elements of society so that people have a place to live, can afford to get around, and all of the things that you need to live a safe and healthy life.
Great. Thank you so much, Jordan. So that concludes our question on the coronavirus. Let's go next to a question on climate change. And the UN estimates that animal agriculture produces more climate pollution than all emissions from cars, trucks, marine vessels, and airplanes combined, with the livestock sector alone making up about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The organization C40 issued the Good Food Cities Declaration, which calls on cities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the agriculture sector. They suggest several measures, including leading by example by establishing food procurement policies within the city institutions that demonstrate a planetary health diet, by supporting an overall increase of plant-based food consumption throughout the city, by reducing food loss and waste by 50% by 2030, and lastly, by developing a stakeholder-informed strategy on reducing emissions from food that feeds into the city's climate action plan. How do you as a candidate see the DC government, city institutions, and DC Food Policy Council playing a role to reduce the immense footprint of greenhouse gas emissions from animal agriculture? For this one, we'll have the order of Kishan, John, Jordan, and Daniel. Starting with Kishan.
Thank you very much for the question. I remember appreciating this question at the Sierra Club Forum as well, and thank you for keeping it top of mind. Food has such a big impact on our environment, which is why I have been a sponsor of the Good Food Institute, which is why I would encourage Mayor Bowser to sign the Good Food Pledge and movement. And it's why we're leading by example. My little prop again, plant-based. Let's eat plant-based. It's so important. My family has been switching to plant-based, and the Good Food Institute is coming up with more and more meat alternatives to plant-based options. And I got to tell you, they taste really good, a lot of them. And so I want to invest in this movement so that we can encourage more of my neighbors to try plant-based, and to stay plant-based. At least, you know, start with a couple meals a week. We need to push that. I would like Mayor Bowser to join the other mayors and sign that pledge so we can join the rest of the world in doing our part. Climate change is, as you've heard, an existential threat. I have a little boy. I don't want him to live with our problems, with our mistakes, the rest of his life, and for his kids as well. So I'm fully in support and on your side on this, and we need to reduce our meat consumption, and my family is leading by example, and I'm changing as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Kishan. Okay, John is next.
Yes, so in response to your questionnaire, I said yes, reducing emissions from food, particularly animal agriculture, is one of the biggest tools for addressing climate change. And as a large city, with a strong sustainability plan, DC is well positioned to be a leader in this field. And I think how we dispose of food waste, right? So, you know, I would support not only like other mayors have done in other cities, but also encouraging the mayor to sign on to the C40 Good Food Cities Declaration, along with coming up with some policies of how we dispose of food waste. More composting stations, like an example is the one at the DuPont Farmers Market, and how we can secure more funding for food composting stations throughout the wards and throughout the city. So I think there's things that we could do to improve the climate and reduce pollution. And that's my response.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
We'll have Jordan next.
Thank you. Yeah, I absolutely think we should sign on to the C40 declaration. And I think when it comes to reducing the emissions caused by animal agriculture, I think one thing that's happening right now as a result of this pandemic is our restaurants and food service establishments have been hit particularly hard. And the council needs to do more to support them and to get them back on their feet. But there's also an opportunity. We can create incentives as we're doing that to reduce, to get to where we want to be when it comes to reducing emissions from animal agriculture. So let's make that part of any of our recovery process, right? Let's make sure that we are rebuilding not just to where we were, but to get better than where we went. And when it comes to C40, you know, I think only LA may be the only to sign on. Let's lead. Let's have DC lead in America by showing what we can do in response and rebuilding to coronavirus by reducing emissions from animal agriculture.
Thank you, Jordan. We'll have Daniel next.
Sure. So of course I do support, you know, as we talked about the, you know, Sierra Club Forum signing on to the declaration. I would add like what we can actually do here in DC. You know, a couple things. One, particularly in our schools and our education system, ensuring, you know, greater availability of, you know, fruits and vegetables and so on, and quality fruits and vegetables, and making it a regular part of diets, or encouraging that. I think also one of the key aspects is increasing the availability of fruits and vegetables for our residents across the district as a whole. You know, concerns about food deserts, the lack of grocery stores in Ward 7 and 8 have been a, I guess, long-running issue. And, you know, people need to have them available at their local accessible grocery store, and to have a local accessible grocery store, you know, if we want to make progress here. So I think those are the two things that here in DC that we can actually, you know, move forward on if we're committed to it.
Thank you, Daniel. Okay, next we'll have, the next four will be Patrick, Yilin, Jack, and Brooke. Starting with Patrick.
Yeah, thank you. I think that we can, and like the others, I agree about signing on to the declaration. And I think that we can reach the objectives of the declaration by investing and scaling in some of what we're already doing. So think specifically, we have a phenomenal urban agriculture program at the University of the District of Columbia that works all across the city to try and give residents the basic skills that they need to maintain a garden in their community. So community gardens are very important to that, you know, in producing close to home produce. I think forging a better relationship with the National Park Service, and I think specifically about some of our urban parks, some around Francis Stevens, where a better working relationship with the National Park Service would enable us to use some of their land that otherwise lies fallow for urban agriculture purposes. We have a phenomenal food prints program at Francis Stevens that we helped get started a couple of years ago through the ANC with grant funding, and a demonstration kitchen that was installed at the school. So the kids at Francis, they're going through a very enriching experience where they're not only growing the fruits and vegetables, but they're then taking them in to cook in the school and seeing how easy it is to take something from farm to table and preparation to consumption. So that's the type of thing that builds lifelong practices. And that's, I think, how you reduce the demand side to reduce animal emissions in the district.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. Yilin?
I do agree with signing on to the declaration. I think that it's important. It's separated for me into two pieces. One is having the right policy incentives, and to providing enough financial resources so that all residents are able to access plant-based foods, healthy foods. And so with the incentives, I want to give an example with, for example, foie gras, right? In some states, they made it illegal and then they legalized it. The problem with foie gras is that we have industrialized the way that we produce food. So geese consuming more food and gaining fat in the throat area is actually a natural part of their migration process. And so some farms allow their geese to do that as a part of their natural migration process. But because we have industrialized the way that we produce food and the way that we deliver food massively to populations of people, we have made it unsafe for the animals involved, and we've just made it an inhumane process. So I think we need to make sure that we have the right policy incentives so that organizations are getting their food from the suppliers that are practicing humane practices. And then the last part is it's important that we make sure that every individual, no matter their income, is able to access plant-based foods, vegetarian and vegan foods, because oftentimes it is very expensive and a lot of individuals and families cannot afford to do that. So it's important to educate and to provide the financial resources.
Great. Thank you, Yilin. We'll have Jack next.
I certainly support the mayor signing on to the C40, but your question goes to what as a council member can you do to help establish and reduce the emissions from animal agriculture? And it comes down to this. What I would do is work with your organization and other organizations to craft legislation that implements the C40 recommendations here in the District of Columbia. I'll give you an example. It's what we did in reducing carbon emissions. We put together a task force and we put together the recommendations into law in the District of Columbia to reduce carbon emissions over the next 20 years. That's exactly what we need to do in this situation. Put together legislation, introduce it, which I would do, have a hearing on it, which brings together the expertise across the country to talk about it, because we would be one of the few jurisdictions that's done it, and pass the law and enforce it as time goes forward. That's how you accomplish the goal which we are trying to do in reducing these emissions.
Great. Thank you, Jack. And lastly, we'll have Brooke.
So I'm absolutely in favor of the C40 Good Food Cities Declaration. It will decrease DC's emission from food and help all of our residents make healthier lifestyle choices. C40 estimates that our cities consume between 50 and 70% of the food in this country. And so we need to take our responsibility as a leader and the nation's capital really seriously in adopting this declaration. Under the standard, we will align our food procurement policies to make sure that there are healthier options for plant-based eating. It reduces food loss and waste by up to 50%. And it allows us to collaborate more with the government, citizens, businesses, and other public institutions to really work together to achieve these lofty but important goals. I am in favor of the DC Urban Farming Food and Security Act, which made DC a commitment to local and healthy food produce by establishing these community gardens. And we have the data now to demonstrate that they work. In the West End Garden, there's already a 50-person wait list. And so these programs should be expanded. What we also know is that these laws are only as good as their enforcement and implementation, which is why I was proud to start and lead the first environmental working group while I was at the DC Attorney General's office, where we brought together stakeholders from the environmental advocacy groups, as well as businesses and residents, to understand what the needs are, which companies were violating the law, and how we can work together with our agencies to go after specific incidents of violations, as well as address pattern and practice cases.
Great. Thanks so much, Brooke. And that concludes our question on climate change. Let's go ahead and move to the next one. US law provides that people in public housing should be able to have companion animals such as dogs and cats. Yet amidst our city's housing crisis, DC Housing Authority has made an exemption to this rule to prohibit most pets from public housing. So that means people who have pets and are housing insecure are forced to choose between stable housing and their companion animals. I asked the candidates, would you support revising this ban on pets for people seeking public housing? And for this order, we'll have Jack, Kishan, Daniel, and Patrick as the first four, starting with Jack.
And the answer to your question is yes. Again, as a dog owner my entire life and knowing the value of having pets, I think it is very important for all of our residents, no matter where they live, to be able to avail themselves of that. And so I would support any kind of legislation that would remove that restriction. As we all know, though, the Public Housing Authority is a separate entity, part of the district government, but also an independent entity within the district government. So sometimes it's not just as easy as the council passing a law to make this happen. So we'll have to work closely with the administration, with the Public Housing Authority, and with the council in order to have that restriction lifted. Clearly, one understands why it's there, but also in this time, especially with this virus and the ramifications that are going to take place after this, I think it's critical that people, no matter again where they live, have the ability to have pets as companions. So I would very, very much work with the organization to support removing that restriction.
Thank you, Jack. Next, we will have Kishan.
Thank you very much. As I wrote in my questionnaire, absolutely. And as I mentioned in my intro, I have friends who've been working to allow pets in their buildings. They're not in public housing, but they're in private housing, and they're still not allowed to. I want to go back to what I was talking about in my last answer about dispelling myths. There are too many myths about animals and about pets. It is more than possible to coexist with our pets and our animal companions in our world, in our city, and in our homes, and in our apartment buildings, and in our public housing as well. It's the exception that's the case in DC, and that's an embarrassment. I am embarrassed that my city is so intolerant of pets and animals in public housing for low-income people, making them make that choice. Shame on us. We need to do better. We need to be more understanding. And to the loneliness point, again, that Vivek Murthy speaks about, I'm so proud that he's endorsed my campaign, because I get it. I get it, and I will fight for those people. I fought for my friends and former residents at the co-op, the Chastleton Cooperative. We're trying to change the rules there to allow animals there. We need to do it in more buildings around this city. Animals are not a threat. They are important, and we need to accommodate them and live with them. And I'm leading by example, and I'll continue to do so. And my former resident at the Chastleton is the head of the Good Food Institute. Your time is up. Yeah, thank you very much.
Next, we'll have Daniel.
All right, so yeah, for me, this one's pretty straightforward. We definitely should be lifting that restriction. I think I understand there are some complications, and pets and housing is, there are always people who are irresponsible, and that can cause damage and stuff. So I understand the consideration, but we need to end the trend of treating lower income folks as lesser people. You'll see this, like as some states have passed like drug testing requirements for welfare recipients, when statistics show welfare recipients actually do not use drugs at any higher rate than the overall population. And on the other hand, why even care about it?
That's cool. That's cool. That's cool.
So it's just simply, this is an outdated, silly rule that, people deserve the companionship and to keep their pets with them.
Thank you, Daniel. And next we'll have Patrick.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that we need to work with the Housing Authority to lift outright or modify the restriction, because I think, as has been alluded to, there are legitimate reasons that a landlord would put a policy like that into place. However, people who live in public housing are entitled to the right of companionship. So if it's an issue with pet allergies, perhaps we're looking at certain properties that are pet friendly, or certain floors of particular properties that are pet friendly, to protect the health of other residents, particularly since a lot of residents in public housing we know deal with underlying respiratory issues and asthma in many cases. So I don't think we want to exacerbate any of those sorts of things, but we want to provide for companionship for residents who need it the most. And I think, thinking of my building in particular, I think you pay a $50 fee if you want to have a cat in your building. They ban dogs outright. My previous apartment building had a no pets policy altogether. So I think it's even beyond public housing into looking at our housing writ large and seeing how we can better facilitate and promote policies that allow for pet companionship.
Thank you, Patrick. All right, our next four will have Yilin, John, Jordan, and Brooke, starting with Yilin.
I absolutely agree with what the candidates have said. I think it's really important that no matter your socioeconomic level, you should be allowed to have a companion animal with the right parameters in place to make sure that everyone can be safe and healthy. You should be able to have a companion animal in public housing, and so we need to work with the Housing Authority to get that done. And I also want to take a moment to shed some light on the homeless population too, where some of the individuals that I've met, they have service dogs, and that's often their only source of love and companionship. And unfortunately, they can't take them into some of the shelters, so they really have nowhere to go. And so that's the culture and the policy position we need to take. We need to make sure that we don't make it hard for people to access companionship when they need it most and when they're the most vulnerable populations.
Great. Thanks so much, Yilin. Next, John.
Yes, so Yellen kind of beat me to it. I think that we have to offer tenants an opportunity to own pets within the Housing Authority properties. And I also think we need to, as we build new affordable housing, accommodate these facilities with amenities, because years ago we didn't really have dog parks in the city, and there was not anywhere local where people could go and walk their pet, even if it's on the roof. And also pet-friendly shelters. I'm trying to work with a couple of folks that are homeless here on 14th Street, and they don't want to leave the street because they don't want to have to give up their pet. So I would support legislation and make some changes to have some pet-friendly shelters and accommodating in development amenities for tenants to own pet dogs. And also if there's a fee involved, because where I live, if you pay $250 security deposit, you're capable of owning a dog. So yes, I would work on changing some of the city's policies.
Great. Thank you, John. We'll have Jordan next.
Thanks. Yeah, I definitely believe we need to lift that prohibition. I think it is unnecessarily discriminates against folks who, based on their income. I think we do need to talk about exactly what a few folks have mentioned, which is some of our neighbors who are experiencing homelessness, who are having to live on the street. And one of the reasons is that they don't have somewhere to go with their pets. And I think that's something that we need to recognize as a huge barrier in the midst of our affordable housing crisis. And it's not just, what may meet the eye, but what more things we need to do. I think to take a broader step as well, we need to think about our public housing beyond this issue. We have so many folks, it's the conditions of our public housing in DC are shameful. We have so many people who are experiencing, children and the elderly who are going to the emergency room because of the conditions of our public housing. And it's something that we as a government, we need to address. I think it should be our top environmental justice priority that we actually address and mitigate some of these challenges that are hurting some of the most vulnerable members of our society in public housing and across our city. So I think it's not just letting folks have the companionship of a pet, but addressing all of the issues that affect the health and well-being of the folks who are most vulnerable in our society.
Thank you, Jordan. And lastly, Brooke.
Sure. So this is an issue that I've worked on for many years. While I worked at the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless, we raised over $1 million to help our neighbors in greatest need. And something that we saw often with our clients was that they were kicked out of buildings and were discriminated against because of their pets. And so this is absolutely something that is a priority for me going forward. we know that when people have to give up their pets, it causes great trauma, not only for the animal, but for the family losing the pet. And with someone that we're trying to help get on the right path to re-enter into society and get them stabilized in housing so that we can help provide access to other medication, healthcare challenges, to get people jobs, we should not be adding trauma to them. So that's a huge priority for me. And I also believe it's discriminatory to prohibit people with housing vouchers and people living in public housing from being able to keep their pets. I also want to note something I mentioned at the outset, that this is another area where we are reminded how important statehood is and how important it is to have our own autonomy. We need to work more collaboratively with the federal government to use the little leverage that we have right now during this crisis to explain to them, this is our jurisdiction. There's one thing to put in contingencies over other budgetary matters, but this is not something that needs to cost the federal government anything. And accordingly, it should not be something that they have their finger on the scale to prohibit us from legislating responsibly within our own jurisdiction.
Thank you, Brooke. All right. For our last question from the moderator, we'll talk about budget and governance. DC has a history of budgeting for both companion animals and wildlife, with the organizations Humane Rescue Alliance and City Wildlife in the city doing amazing things for animals. These local organizations offer services like spay and neuter, adoption, wildlife rehabilitation, and tracking wildlife risks to public health, which is particularly important now, knowing how human-wildlife interaction can cause problems like infectious diseases. Knowing that these organizations are funded through city grants, would you commit to making sure that funding for these grants and organizations continues? And are there other city resources that you would use to support the animal community? For this last question, after we do this question, we'll move to questions from the audience. And for this last question, the first four for our order, we'll have Brooke, Kishan, Daniel, and Jack. Starting with Brooke.
I'm still off mute. So thank you for the question. I actually spoke with Emily Hovermill from the Humane Rescue Alliance today about these issues. And I think that a lot of the data demonstrates in other European countries and what our own programs have demonstrated in DC is that they're very effective to trap and spade or neuter and then release the wild animals back into their natural habitat. So I think that that's going to be something I support going forward. Another piece is that during this crisis, we are going to need to rely on our nonprofit and for-profit partners to achieve the really important work that all of our residents rely on. So I was really pleased to see in last week's supplemental emergency bill, the DC Council reduced some of the restrictions that the DC government has around sharing information about for-profit and nonprofit entities. And that's going to be something that I'm looking to expand going forward, especially as we work to get through this crisis. There are a lot of organizations out there who are doing really important work, and the government needs to lean on them during this crisis as we all work to share this responsibility to overcome it, to make sure that they have what they need and that the government is allowed to share resources and guide other people to fundraise for those organizations so that we can all get through this together without increasing our spending measures irresponsibly.
I was muted. Kishan, you're next.
Would you please repeat the question? I had my son running by. I want to make sure I heard you correctly.
Yep, gladly. The question was in reference to DC having a history of budgeting in grants for both companion animals and wildlife, and supporting organizations like the Humane Rescue Alliance and City Wildlife. And I want to know if you would commit to making sure funding for those grants continues, and are there other city resources that you would use to support the animal community?
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciated the very interesting question in your question. Can you all hear me okay? I appreciated okay, thanks, Jordan. I appreciated the very interesting question in your questionnaire about the funding for low-income residents to afford veterinary services. That is vital as well. We should not have low-income residents choose between putting their animals down, ending their lives just because they can't afford a couple $100s. That is a tragedy. It happens today, and we need to prevent it. For the most needy residents, I am in support of that, and largely that goes through grants, and I support. I definitely want to support. For the last 6 years, all I've done is worked with community-based organizations in every part of the city, but especially in the low-income parts of the city, east of the river, Ward 5, 6, 7, 8, and community-based groups. That is the best way to help regular people through community outreach, and that's what I did for the last 6 years. Of course, I will always support community outreach and grants to good community groups doing good work in our city. You can count on it.
Thanks, Kishan. Daniel is next.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. So I definitely support the existing funding, and I guess as the city grows or as needs grow, accounting for that. I do want to echo Brooke, partnership with the various nonprofits or other organizations out there as they also do work in this space. Something as simple as the Kitten Cafe, kind of an offshoot of the Cat Cafe, is probably my favorite 30 minutes I've spent in DC. Enabling spaces and enabling things like that, I think, are an important part of this. Making it easy for the government to interface and interact with and support those organizations, rescue organizations, organizations that also seek to address I guess broader wildlife. And we should always be compassionate about raccoons here in DC as well.
Thank you, Daniel. Next, Jack.
Question is basically, will the next council member, hopefully myself, support the grants that are going to these two organizations? And my answer is yes. And what I bring to the council is 20 years of experience chairing the Finance and Revenue Committee. We are going into a situation, and everyone must realize this, where between now and September 30th, the city will lose between $600 million and $1 billion in revenue. We have reserves that can get us through September 30th, but after that, the reserves have to be paid back. We spend 80% of our money in human services, education, public safety, and debt service. And in those areas, this next council is going to have to make substantial changes. And I can assure you, one of the places they're going to be looking are grants for these types of organizations. You don't need a supporter, you need an advocate. And over the last 30 years, I have developed a reputation as someone who can get things done on the council. If I am your council member, I guarantee you funding for these organizations will continue, because I have many ideas on how we're going to close that budget gap.
Great. Thank you, Jack. Okay, next four, John, Yilin, Jordan, and Patrick. Starting with John.
Yes, so yes, I would support the continuation of funding, but I've experienced firsthand the need for animal rescue. One time there was a possum caught in the gutter on top of a house. And of course, the human animal control didn't come for about 4 or 5 hours. And on another occasion, there was a dog stuck along the canal on Foot Street Northeast that runs out into the Anacostia River. And no one showed up there for about 3.5 hours. So I have experienced firsthand the need for services like this for animal rescue. And I think the Humane Alliance should be funded, and also animal control. We need more individuals that can go out and save animals. So I would be very supportive of finding alternate means of funding for these programs. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Yilin?
I'm also absolutely supportive of continuing the grant. It is an interesting time where our economy is going to feel not just now, but long-term effects of this pandemic. And so it's important that we make sure that I think we take a really deep dive into our budget, which has now a different timeline, and to make sure that our priorities across the council are aligned so that we can get things done. And so it is someone that is able to negotiate and build those relationships. And, you know, we talked about public-private partnerships. That's something that I've done most of my career in the healthcare field. So it's all very relationship-based. And so we need someone who can negotiate and have those conversations. And that's something that I can bring to the table.
Thank you. Jordan?
Thank you. I definitely support the grants. I think beyond that, I think we should expand what the Animal Education Outreach Fund is eligible to be used for veterinary services and other services for people with animals. I think there's, to get to the question of what else we can do from DC government, I think we should establish an animal welfare liaison in the Mayor's Office of Community Affairs. I think as someone who's worked in a coordination office in government before, with topics like this, where there's different strands where animal policy and animal rights affect agencies, but it's not their central purpose, you can often benefit from having someone in a central office who's be able to bring those things together and make sure we're getting the most out of what we have on the books and putting it to use. So I think that's something that would be an incredibly useful position that wouldn't cost a ton of money, but would be very helpful. And the last thing, I think, especially in the time of coronavirus, I think we need to make sure we're supporting DC Health's Animal Services Program for people to be able to make preparations, emergency response preparations for their animals and pets. I think it's become more important than ever. It's not just in the case of a virus. There's so many other instances that people need to be able to plan for the future of the animals in their life. So I think we need to make sure we're providing as much support as possible to that program out of DC Health.
Thank you, Jordan. And lastly, Patrick.
Yeah, I think, as has been alluded to before, we're going to face some very difficult decisions with respect to the budget, not only in terms of trying to make whole the budget deficit through the end of this fiscal year, but thinking about next year's budget too. And those conversations are going to be taking place on the council in the next several months, certainly even looking forward to next year. So I think we need a council member who can step into this role, so including those who are running in the special election, who can play a part in those deliberations and set the tone for what service delivery is going to look like from our much reduced baseline of what's available. And I think when you talk about things like the Humane Rescue Alliance, what John has alluded to specifically, these are entities that bear directly on the quality of life of our residents. So I think we want to be investing in things that make efficient use of our tax dollars, that are responsive to the needs and desires of our residents. And so that's why I think it's critically important to fund these protections. But I think you need a council member who will be at the table later on this year when those conversations are taking place, and have the ability and have the credibility with their colleagues to be able to advocate for these particular interests.
Thank you, Patrick. So that concludes our questions from the moderator. We're running short on time, so we're not going to be able to do much from the audience, but I do want to just recognize that many great comments were submitted. Thank you for all who submitted not only comments but clarifications. There were lots that I would love to dive into more, but I'm gonna take a couple different questions and parse them together, because there are some important points here, particularly about animals that are treated as nuisance species in DC, and this includes deer being shot right in our backyard by the National Park Service in Rock Creek Park, rats who are being poisoned, and they are the poisons are being placed throughout the community that can be inhumane and can be dangerous to other species. And then we might be seeing an influx of coyotes and even bobcats in the years ahead in and around our community, and particularly as our residents are staying at home more. So the question for you is, should we look into more humane and responsible ways to manage animals? And if so, what might be the first steps? For this one, the order will be Jack, John, Jordan, and Brooke. Starting with Jack.
Yes, as mentioned many times, an animal advocate and lover my entire life, we absolutely do need to do this more humanely. I remember when the National Park Service did shoot deer in Rock Creek Park, which was an outrage that the council took a very strong position against. And so the end of the story is we have to come up with better ways to deal with deer, the coyotes if they come back, and bobcats, et cetera, et cetera. Rats are a different story. Rats are a real problem in Ward 2. And I have worked my entire time on the council trying to help eliminate the rat populations, particularly in our commercial corridors. That's why I was the sponsor of and the financier of the trash compactors, giving businesses tax breaks to get those compactors on 17th Street, 9th Street, 14th Street, Wisconsin Avenue, Connecticut Avenue, where we have the restaurants. Remember, the district, Ward 2 is home to over 50% of the restaurants in the District of Columbia. And so that is a very major problem that we deal with now. And most recently, I'm starting to hear of a proliferation of the rats back in our neighborhoods again. So as your council member, I will redouble my efforts to try and eliminate that nuisance that we have here. As far as the other animals, though, we do need to be much more humane. And I remember supporting a bill that Mary Chey had dealing with raccoons, et cetera, where instead of killing these animals, we trap them and then release them into the wild. And that's the kind of approach we need to take as we go forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Next, John.
Yeah, so the deer hunt that we have every year, I think we should be rounding the deer up and setting them free into the Appalachian or the Blue Ridge Mountains like Mr. Evans has mentioned. But the rat issue, I was one of the very first ANC commissioners that organized the rat summit and got the Department of Health, the rodent abatement team and pest control companies together, and we went out and came up with a plan of how to eradicate the rats in Logan Circle. And there's a couple things, so it goes back to my food disposal, the whole composting, because where there's a food source, there'll be rats. And we could work with the restaurants on an initiative to, use their food disposal to composting stations. And along with our commercial trash cans, you see them crawling up and down. They run from people's front yards out to the Main Street corridors and into our trash receptacles. And we have what's called big bellies. And they're solar and they are closed and rodents cannot get into them to reach their food source. So, and the trash compactors, right? And the whole big thing is there's never enough funding for them. So I would like to increase funding for trash compactors and have a conversation with the Park Service about their next deer hunt, that they take our recommendation about rounding them up and, moving them to Virginia. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Jordan?
Yeah, I agree that we need to be more humane in addressing these animals, but I do think that being humane doesn't mean we don't address things like the rat problem. I think, there have been, 30 years or so of efforts that have not been quite as successful. I do think we can do things like strongly promoting more commercial composting to address the problem in the first place and reduce waste. I think we can promote more of the zero waste initiatives to make sure that we're reducing the waste in the first place that doesn't get there. And then we can also look at broader reforms to our waste management. I know New York City just recently did a comprehensive reform to how they handle commercial waste, so that you don't have all of these different private companies handling different waste and driving all over the city and, creating not only just emissions, but not handling it particularly well, as opposed to a much more structured approach that would address some of these issues when it comes to our rat population. And I think there's just a way we can change how we think about this to make sure that we're focusing on reducing the waste we produce, so we don't have to have this conversation about what's the best way to treat these animals in the most humane way. We can do it and prevent it in the first place.
Thank you. And Brooke?
So we need to be really humane about how we're addressing the overpopulation of some of our animals. There have been some forward-thinking ideas with the park rangers of introducing coyotes to help reduce some of the population of deer, or to have vaccines and of sterilization so that deer aren't overpopulating the area. When it comes to rodent infestation, this is another issue that I have worked extensively on when I used to represent the Office of the Tax and Revenue. One of the main legal challenges that would come up were building owners' valuation of their property. And I went to one office building who was making the argument that they should be designated a Class C, not a Class A office building, to lower designation to reduce their tax bill. And as they toured us around, the entire bottom floor was filled with rodents. And upon further inquiry and litigation, we determined that they had done that on purpose so that their designation would be lowered to reduce their tax bill. But what they didn't realize was they lived, or their building was right next door to a major restaurant, which with other dumpsters. And so that rodent infestation problem that they did not clean up on purpose created a problem for the entire block. And I bring that up to suggest that our rodent problem in this city is tied to a lot of other concerns, and is going to be another area where we really need to increase our collaboration agency-wide so that we're really getting at the root cause and preventing the behavior and enforcing behavior when there are bad actors.
Thank you, Brooke. Okay, next four: Yilin, Kishan, Patrick, and Daniel.
So 15 years ago, when I was a freshman at the University of Michigan, I had thought maybe I would be a philosophy major. And in that time, that's when I read Peter Singer's work. He's the gentleman who revolutionized the word speciesism and wrote Animal Liberation more than 40 years ago. And it really talks about how we look at our animal kingdom in relation to humans in a hierarchy. So we look at our animals as us above animals, etc. But the reality is that we are an entire ecosystem. And like we said in the beginning of this forum, we don't quite understand how some of our actions are going to lead to downstream effects in our environment and our own human lives and for generations to come. So with the example of deers, I mean, we are cutting down more and more trees. We're moving into more woodland areas. And so that's why the deers are having to move to different places, which I don't agree with the shooting of the deers. With the rats, that's happening because, I mean, rats are there because there's food waste. And so rats can get into a garbage can, even if it's a quarter of an inch open. So we need to make sure that we enforce our policies so that it's fully compliant. But rats are there because humans are creating waste, and that's allowing their population to thrive and survive. And also because of the development that's happening, when we dig up land, it opens up rat mounds, and so they have to find other places to have their burrows. So all of this is, there's a bi-directional relationship between humans and animals. And I think the most important thing is that we need to be cognizant of how our behaviors impact the ecosystem. And my vision for Ward 2 is to make sure that we have more green space for residents and animals to enjoy. Thank you.
Thanks, Yilin. Next, Kishan. You might be muted. Go ahead.
Can everyone hear me? Sorry. Thank you, Max, for the question. As I mentioned at the Sierra Club, I am in favor of composting. Right behind me is my compost bin. Behind that is my rain barrel. And I believe in composting. I believe in curbside composting, and that will help with these problems. In terms of where I'm living right now, I'm at 39th and T. Right next to us is the Glover Archibald Park and Rock Creek Park. There are deer right here on my lawn from time to time, right here on 39th Street from time to time, and I deal with these issues as a commissioner already. So you have someone in me who's already been dealing with animal issues, with wildlife issues constantly. I hear about the deer all the time, and I believe in acting humanely. Sterilization is one option, both for deer and for rodents. I've worked with the Department of Health on nation efforts. We had cutting back on funding, especially during, in terms of them being elective procedures for low income and for rescues. We can't do that. We can't afford to do that right now. What I want to say, one last thing, Councilmember Jack Evans talks a lot about what we can and can't afford and how he can find the money. But what's really important is we need to cut back on the unnecessary subsidies to corporate entities in our city. We've overspent too much. We need to, if we cut there, we can find funding for some of these programs. Thank you.
Patrick?
Yeah, I think rodent and residential quality of life don't necessarily go hand in hand, and that's sort of the bête noire, I think, for those of us who are ANC commissioners. You know, like John, we've had a lot of conversations in Foggy Bottom about some of the residential complaints, you know, from the rodent population. So I think this requires a couple of different things. And I remember, to Jack's point earlier, being on Mary Che's staff. I worked for her for a semester when I was in college, and I remember that was right after Rush Limbaugh, I think, had started decrying the Wildlife Protection Act on his show. And so the people in the office were talking about all of the well-informed commentary that they were getting from Rush's listeners. But I mean, there is a serious reason why you want to have humane wildlife protections, and it's not incompatible with residential quality of life, but it takes a degree of coordination and understanding where different parts of the government can work. So the Department of Health to understand the underlying issues, the Department of Public Works to supervise trash collection and storage. I remember the ANC in DuPont Circle protested all of the liquor licenses of all the restaurants on a square to get them to go in on buying a trash compactor. It means coordinating with the National Park Service on their practices for rodent abatement. The most amusing exchange I think I ever witnessed at an ANC meeting was NPS and a rodentologist talk about the virtues of birth control for rats as a way to prohibit procreation, while at the same time not doing anything that involves the use of poisons or other things that have negative externalities and are cruel. So I think we need to double down on those efforts.
Thank you, Patrick. And lastly, Daniel.
Sure. So our animal control policies should definitely, have a focus on being humane, and trap and release, of course, should be used whenever and wherever possible. As we talk about rats so much in this, it's kind of funny. Like back when we could still go door to door, that was honestly probably the issue that came up the most, particularly as you get closer to the commercial and the restaurant corridors. I think it's something that we can't just keep doing what we're doing. We need to have a comprehensive, holistic approach. If rodent control is responding just to point issues, obviously that's been insufficient. We've talked about a lot of these issues. And in addition to some of those other comments, we need to have proper data, case tracking, and information accessibility to holistically address it.
Thank you so much, Daniel. So that concludes our questions from both DC Voters for Animals and the audience. And we'll move now to closing statements. And before we go to closing statements, I'll open up the second poll to see how folks are feeling about the candidates. And feel free to weigh in. The answers are anonymous. And for our closing statements, we'd like to hear from the candidates on what makes you the best candidate in Ward 2 for animal priorities. And we have a wide variety of animal lovers on this call, from folks looking after their dogs and cats and dog parks, and folks concerned about wildlife, and folks concerned about factory farms and climate pollution and animals in labs. So looking forward to hearing from the candidates as we conclude this forum. And for the last question, we'll start with Patrick, John, Kishan, and Yilin.
Well, thank you again very much, Max, for organizing this event, and to all the folks who participated in making this possible. I think there are some broadly applicable qualities that we want to apply to our next council member that are also useful for those who are interested in animal issues first and foremost. And I think that our campaign really embodies a lot of them. Over the course of my years of service at the community level, I think that I've developed a reputation for being a pretty balanced person, a very thoughtful person, and somebody who's able to work with many different people of competing interests in order to achieve results. And sometimes it is very difficult, especially when you have to weigh a lot of competing priorities. And that's going to be more important now than ever before, just based on some of the tough choices that we're going to be forced into in the coming months. I'm very proud of our engagement at the grassroots level, having the endorsement of half the ANC commissioners and Ward 2 community leaders all across this ward. I think understanding the sentiment of residents and understanding how important animals are to our residents and the many dimensions of the policies that we can take that directly affect people's quality of life is a really important sensibility to bring to a lot of these conversations at the Wilson Building. So I would greatly appreciate the support of those of you who feel that these are your top priority issue. I think that there's a lot that we can achieve in all different realms of policy, but I'm just very grateful for the opportunity to address this group tonight, grateful for the time to speak. If you would like to learn more about our campaign and our stance on all of the issues, you can go to patrickforward2.com. Again, that's Patrick, for spelled out F-O-R, ward2.com. Would love to hear from you. I already got one email from somebody who engaged as a result of this forum. So would love to continue the conversation with you over the course of the campaign. And for those of you that are in the ward, I would appreciate your consideration and your support on June 2nd and June 16th. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. And John is next.
John, you're not you're muted.
Sorry. Hi.
Good.
Hi, John Fanning. Thank you so much, Max, for organizing this animal rights forum with the sponsors. And I basically think that I'm more prepared than all the other candidates to be the next elected council member to represent the residents of Ward 2, particularly my knowledge of the government and navigating the city agencies and delivering city services, and the years that I've had developing relationships with folks in the government. I have a reputation of getting things done. I will be very accessible. I won't be locked in some back room monitoring who needs to, if anyone needs anything, they could come right down to our office. And I think it's going to be important for the next council member to do this position full time, which I will. There's a lot of work to be done in the ward. As you know, we have a large homeless population. There's a lot of small businesses closing up on our commercial corridors, a lot of storefronts with brown paper. So there's going to be a lot of coordination with all the stakeholders in the ward. And I think I have the capability of doing that. I think that my tenure as an ANC commissioner for 6 terms, my colleagues have elected me on 6 different occasions to serve as the chairman. I know that there's a lot of concerns in the ward that have not been attended to. Homelessness, affordable housing, public safety will be a priority of mine. And I think I have the institutional knowledge to be a highly effective council member to represent Ward 2. So you can visit my website, fanningforward2.com. 50 days to the election. We're all voting by mail. Sign up and get your absentee ballot. If not, if you need any assistance with that, you could call me personally. We've been out delivering food to our most vulnerable residents, seniors with disabilities, individuals that don't have access to vehicles to get to the grocery store. So I'm asking for your vote on June 2nd, which is the primary, and June 16th. You will have a partner at City Hall.
Thank you, John.
You will have a strong voice, and I look forward to working with all of you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Kishan?
Great. Thanks, Max, and thanks to A Vegan Life, American University's Animal Law Society, DC Voters for Animals, Opening Doors, the Veg Society of DC. What a great group of passionate people that I'm so proud to call fellow DC residents, and hopefully many of them are Ward 2 as well. And I look forward to representing these issues and these you on the council. I want to say that I want you to know you will always have an open door with me as council member. I want to be much more transparent than council members of the past, and to open the door to you to have monthly conference calls, video chats like this from my home or from my council chambers. We're all embracing technology these days, different ways that you can keep in touch and let me know what your issues and concerns are. But right now, we are in a crisis, and it is a healthcare crisis and an economic crisis. And for the last 6 years, I was small business outreach liaison for DC Health Link. And for the last 15 years, I've been working on healthcare policy. So I have the healthcare experience, the DC healthcare experience, and the DC small business experience. We need to support our small businesses. I've been working with our small business community for the last 6 years, understanding their concerns. Many of them, if we can get out of this crisis, then we can make sure that we can focus on all the issues that we share and have in common. But I want you to know they are priorities for me, and that I want to be your council member starting this June to help us get out of this crisis with my healthcare and small business experience, so that we can get back on track and support the animals of our city. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kishan. Next, Yilin.
One of the issues that I've been working on these last 2.5 years is DC statehood with the League of Women Voters. And we've been educating the community about what it means to not have a voice and voting representation in Congress. And that's an impact that we're feeling severely now that Congress has cut us short by $750 million, even though DC residents pay the most in federal taxes per capita. And we have a larger population than 2 states. And with DC statehood, I found my voice in that it is ever more important that everyone have a voice in our democracy. And it's important when elected that I want to make sure that all residents have a voice that is heard. So no matter what the issue is, I'm going to maintain an open door policy and be accessible to the everyday resident, and not just for for-profit corporations. So it's important that we maintain equal accessibility to all people, and that's what I would commit to. In terms of my own background, again, I've spent the last 10 years in the healthcare industry, and I'm still working in the healthcare industry. And I see the resilience that our healthcare workers have and the hard work that they're doing to make sure that every community member is safe. And so what I'm committing to is I want to make sure that access to quality healthcare is equitable, not just in one ward, but across DC. Ward 2 has a high density of hospitals, healthcare systems, but I want to make sure that that's spread out equally across DC. And as a council member, my job is to represent the interests of the ward, but also to make sure that I create fair legislation across DC. And then lastly, an issue that we've talked about quite a bit today is to make sure that DC is an equitable place and an affordable place for all people. So, with our intersection with animal lives, it's important to make sure that every resident, if they need a companion for emotional support, especially, when I first came to DC, I was by myself. I had like 2 suitcases, and I felt quite lonely. And so I think that a lot of people have that feeling, no matter, what socioeconomic level you're at. So it's important that we provide for all individuals and to make sure that we're being proactive. So in times like this, we have the right infrastructure in place to meet the demands of a pandemic. And thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Max, and all of the co-sponsors. Really appreciate everyone for participating. And my website is Yilin, YILIN, 4 ward and the number 2.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yilin. All right. Our last 4 will be Brooke, Jordan, Jack, and Daniel, starting with Brooke.
Well, thank you so much, Max, and the DC Voters for Animals for putting together tonight's really important discussion. It's amazing what technology is able to do. And I'm really grateful for all of your efforts and your continued advocacy around these important issues, as well as helping inform the voters on all of their many options this June. So most laws protecting animals, both that we've discussed tonight and that haven't been mentioned, are really not all that controversial, and yet we see them continue not to be prioritized, like the ban on ivory that was just passed last Tuesday. I was really pleased to see that, but that shouldn't have taken so long. And many of the protections and provisions included in the Animal Care and Control Omnibus Act are really sensible things around prohibiting sexual abuse of animals and making sure that in the case of a divorce, the best interest of the animal is taken into account. And those are really common sense measures that don't need rewriting of every law. They just need a champion to prioritize these issues. And I am the best candidate to do so. As we discussed here tonight, I'm the former Assistant Attorney General for Policy and Legislative Affairs at the DC Office of the Attorney General. And as a tax attorney with this citywide legislative experience, I'm confident that I am best suited to help our city recover from this crisis. These are unusual times, and both to ensure that the most vulnerable among us receive the really needed relief they need, while also ensuring that we're being responsible and strategic about the long-term financial health of our city. So please consider voting for me on June 2nd for the primary, as well as June 16th for the special election. No matter who you're voting for here tonight, I urge you all to order an absentee ballot. You can do so at votefordc.com. It's the number 4. It's really, really important to order your absentee ballot prior to the election because most of the polling locations are going to be closed this year. So I really hope that I've persuaded some of you and earned your vote tonight. And I hope that you can join us at our website, brookepinto4ward2.com. It's the number 2. And I look forward to continuing the discussion going forward. And if you need other COVID resources, we have also placed all of those on our website and look forward to working together going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Brooke. Jordan, you're next.
Thank you. And thank you, Max, again, and for all the co-hosts for organizing this conversation. I think it's been a great discussion. You know, I'm very proud that DC's progressive community has united behind my campaign. We have endorsements from folks like at-large council member Alyssa Silverman, the Washington Teachers Union, environmental leaders like 350 DC, Jews United for Justice Campaign Fund, and many other organizations. You can see why they've decided to back my campaign at jordanforward2.com. And I bring that up because I think whether it's issues related to animals or broader issues and priorities in our city, I think that there's a big difference right now between folks who are using this language of in this crisis of we need to make these tough choices and these budget choices, right? And we're saying, oh, we have this crisis. And yes, we have our tax revenues have taken a hit. But I think what's interesting is in DC, we hear all the time that we need to save our tax revenues for a rainy day. But the rainy day is here. And yet we still have folks, I think Jack just mentioned, how we're gonna need to cut or make all these choices. I think that is the exact opposite approach of what we need. We need to invest in our people and our communities. We need to invest in the frontline workers, grocery workers, healthcare workers, delivery workers, transit workers, so that they can get back on their feet. So we don't consign folks to generation loss. We need to help our teachers who are making distance learning work despite a massive digital divide. We need to make sure everyone is entitled and has access to paid family and medical leave and access to affordable healthcare and childcare. We've seen what happens during this crisis when that is not guaranteed and not available. So look, I think there's a lot of ways people can say we support, you know, the issues that are raised here in the course of a campaign, but it's about living your values and making sure we're going to invest in our people and our businesses and our community to recover from this, whether it's related to animal issues or whether it's related to the rest of, I know, the progressive values that we have in our community. So thank you so much again, Max. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thanks, Jordan. Jack is next.
Okay, well, thank you, Max, for hosting this and the DC Voters for Animals. It's been a very enlightening discussion that we've had here, and as your council member, I will continue to work with you, your organization, and all the animal organizations to implement all of the ideas that we have discussed here tonight. The world has changed, though, in the last 2 months, and so has this election. And I think it can be summed up best by the article in the Washington Post on Saturday by Colbert King, A Crisis in the District. And what he says is this, and I quote, "Evans remains the district's most knowledgeable and experienced lawmaker on the tax code and the city finances." And what he means by this, if you read the article and the articles that are being published about our finances, is that I bring to the table the most experience in dealing with a financial crisis. I was here for the '96 crisis, the 2001 crisis, and the 2009 crisis, and played an instrumental role in navigating this city to the point where it became the most fiscally responsible city in America. I spent 20 years as the chair of the Finance and Revenue Committee and 20 years going to Wall Street, getting our bond rating from a B- to a AAA. Why is this important? Because the finances of this city drive everything. There are things that are extremely important to me, like animal issues, and I'll give you a different example, the arts. No one championed the arts more than I did and got more funding for the arts in the face of enormous opposition than I did. What you need as a council member, if you are an animal supporter, is a council member who has a proven track record of getting things done. And that is my reputation. There has never been a more important time than having an experienced and knowledgeable leader on this council in order to get through the predicament we're in. So again, thank you for having us all tonight. This has been a very, very informative discussion. And I ask everyone who is listening and watching to please vote for me on June 2nd and in the time leading up to that. You need the experience that I bring more than ever.
Thank you, Jack. And our last statement of the night comes from Daniel.
I want to thank you for putting on our virtual candidate forum. This has been, a bit of an experience, and I look forward to, future ones of these. I really ask you to consider one thing. We have enough time ahead. There are going to have to be hard decisions, and I ask you, who do you trust to work and vote in your interest? Who do you trust is here because they want to make a difference and they want to do what's best for DC, and whoever is going to spend their entire life in politics, and that's what they want to make their career, and who's doing things just for show. I'm not someone that spent my life preparing for a run for office. I'm someone who, I've raised a family. I've been to Afghanistan. I've lived a bit of life. But I saw a problem in our ward council representation. One of the earlier questions, Jack talked about the Clean Energy Act and bringing all the stakeholders together to put the best plan together to move forward. That's actually a great model. But what he doesn't mention is the last minute revisions he worked with Pepco to slide in to benefit his paying customers. Or customers that the law firms he was working for at the time represented. I'm someone that you can trust is here for the right reasons and is here because I want to see a better DC. Thank you. I ask you, if you'd like to learn more, visit danielward2.com.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to everybody. This was an absolutely great forum tonight, and I'm really glad to have all the candidates discuss these issues that are important to many people in DC. Thank you again to the candidates, and especially thanks to our co-hosts tonight for just being so amazing, and I'm really grateful for all of the work you all did to make this happen. Before we go, I just want to point out that many people mentioned how important the voting process will be for the upcoming primary and special election. So please, please, please make sure you're squared away with your absentee ballot and voting by mail. You can do that via the DC Board of Elections website, as well as the Vote for DC mobile app. I found it very easy on the Vote for DC mobile app. So that's a great way to do it. And thank you, everybody, once again. My name is Max Broad from DC Voters for Animals. Thanks for joining the Ward 2 Candidate Forum on Animal Issues.